So folks, we're back with another AMA with Hearthstone developer Iksar, and there's a lot of questions. He went crazy this time answering questions, which is awesome, and he wrote a ton. So we're gonna go through these a little quicker perhaps than in the past, but shout out to Iksar for dropping the knowledge this time. So is power creep real? Is it inevitable, desirable? What do you think about a mass nerf or even an annual mass nerf to tone it down? And the answer to this one surprised me. Power creep is a decision. We can do anything we want in terms of balance. We could release an expansion that has cards no one plays because they aren't powerful enough. Remember Rosticons? Wow, dude, that hurts. Power creep isn't intentional, but if our goal is to match current power level, then in some ways it's inevitable. If your goal is to match, then there will be some cards and strategies that miss on the low side and some that miss on the high side. For the ones that miss on the high side, that becomes the new power point to match. This goes on and on. And this is the crazy part. We've discussed a mass nerf. I don't think it's unreasonable. We could do it at a standard rotation set, lower the power of the core set, release a lower power set, and do a bunch of nerfs to the 3 sets from the previous year. Not a crazy idea. As next year approaches, I think we'll consider it closely. That last sentence, I think we'll consider it closely. That's crazy that it's actually really on the table to do a power level reset for Hearthstone. I just didn't even think this was ever something they'd consider, but it's really intriguing to think about the implications of this. So what do you guys think? Would that be a good idea, a bad idea? Would it bother you that like you know, a bunch of cards got nerfed? I don't know what it means to say like a bunch of nerfs, but you could imagine like 20, 30, 40 cards even maybe getting a balance change, like the most powerful stuff getting pulled down. Would that be a welcome thing or an unwelcome thing to have that happen maybe semi-regularly to reset or pull down Hearthstone's power level? All right, so this next question is about sort of the balance across archetypes. Zeddy says, you've said before you want control to be a viable strategy, but with the introduction of infinite non-fatigue damage in both Ignite for Mage and the Warlock questline, and then on top of that, all the turn 6 and 7 OTKs, how are control strategies realistically supposed to work? Iksar says, I think the style of deck that is less fun than any other style is a deck that slowly grinds away all your resources as a win condition with no way of actually dealing damage to you. I actually think that's like my favorite way to play, so it's a little sad to hear that, but I'll admit that they've been pretty consistent in saying they want to give control decks win conditions. I think that also aligns with the goals to make sure that game lengths just aren't too long. So as a YouTube guy who wants like awesome long games for videos, I'm a little sad. It's a guy who just enjoys that style of play. I'm a little sad, but it's consistent. Control decks should have ways to close games outside of relying on decks to empty. So in terms of having decks like Mage and Warlock that are unfazed by deck depletion, I don't see that as a blocker for control. The thing that blocks control decks in an unappealing way are combo decks that complete their combos so early and consistently that a control deck is unlikely to ever close out a game with threats before the combo deck closes out their own strategy. We're probably in that space now, mostly as a population thing. There are a wide variety of combo decks that can close early right now. Part of it is players playing bad decks, which is actually sort of the Mage and Warlock thing. Like, they're solid decks, but they're not the best decks, right? If you look at the data right now, they're not the best, but people like playing it. So both should resolve themselves. Players never play poor decks at a high rate for extended periods, except Big Priest, and we're meeting to discuss any balance tuning on Tuesday. So there's an implication here that some of those will go away naturally, and perhaps some of those will go away through balance tuning. I think based on the data I've seen so far, that makes Mage, of all the mentioned things, the most likely to go away through balance changes based on what we're hearing here. So maybe keep an eye on Mage. It's certainly not any sort of confirmation or anything, just seems possible. So this question's kind of on the same theme here. Multiple decks early in Stormwind have shown uninteractive gameplay. Solitaire, am I right? As everyone seems to say. How do you intend to address that? Iksar says, those strategies existing isn't an issue. Many different strategies should exist. Part of the population issue should subside over time because decks rarely stay populous if they aren't good. Just said that. I do agree that the density of from hand only stuff is too high right now. So dealing all that crazy damage from hand as opposed to interacting with the board Team is looking to finalize balanced decisions on Tuesday and patch afterwards. Can say for certain we're looking to change at least one card. So nerfs are coming, and they're probably going to be something about damage from hand or enabling those sorts of strategies of uninteractive gameplay. So I think Mage is on the table, maybe even Rogue and Garot is on the table, however you say it. Maybe some Warlock stuff. Warlock Quest is certainly doing a ton of damage from hand, sort of. So maybe Stealer Souls could be on the table. I could see a few different ways to change at least one card while addressing this question. I guess we'll find out probably pretty soon. If discussions are happening, I bet action will happen soon after. All right, so next up here is a question about how heavily is the power level of 0 to 2 mana cards scrutinized compared to 8 to 10 mana cards? Quest aside, we've seen a score of 0 to 1 mana powerhouse cards in the past year or so. Many wild decks are curving out at 3. Iksar says 8 to 10 mana cards are so difficult to design these days because unless they win the game most of the time you play them, usually not good enough to include. This is especially true in non-healing / armor classes. While the power of 0 to 2 cost cards is harder for a different reason, usually just because there are so few numbers to work with, and any small change can destroy or immortalize a card. 1 to 2 cost cards also just appear more often. They are more memorable and are the cards you think about when reflecting on what it feels like to play or play against a deck. For that reason, power and feeling tend to be more important to get right. So it sounds like 1 and 2 and 0 cost cards are indeed much harder to design, which I get to. Even when we've done like custom card competitions, like the range of stuff you can see on low cost cards is pretty crazy, whereas people seem to be able to more narrow, like focus in on the right sort of numbers for higher cost things because there's just more variables to play with. That said, I do think this is a sad aspect, the fact that 8 to 10 mana cards kind of have to be game winning. Like that just kind of limits the number that can exist and the cool things that can happen. So, you know, I love to slam those big 7s and 8s and 9 mana minions and just hope it kind of works, although it never really does. All right, so we just kind of talking about cards and balance stuff and standard. Now we're going to talk about some systems type stuff. Any plans have a weekly card temporarily added to rotation, either a new card or a wild one. Meta still feels too stale for too long. And Iksar says, I've been recently thinking about this a lot, just our release cadence in general. Mini sets were a change, though having smaller card releases even more frequently could be really interesting. The complicated piece to figure out is that releasing patching is very expensive in terms of the people it takes to do it. We'd have to create better technical solutions that would allow us to patch more often in less taxing ways. And yeah, this is a really cool thing. I've talked about this a lot, having like some sort of mechanism or system that changes the game state so that metas feel refreshed other than just by adding new cards. And Iksar here sort of reflects that idea too, in a way, because adding cards is expensive and hard for them to do. So I wonder if there's other variables that could be tweaked that would still make an impact. And that's, you know, like these are always terrible examples, right? So let a game designer figure out better ones. But like every card costs more than one more mana this week, or, you know, 8 mana cards cost 7 this week, or just some weird variable tweak, right? And again, I know those are terrible examples, but you might be able to think of a few. Everything has +1 health. Everything is 2 attack. Whatever. Some things would be too dramatic and too crazy, right? But just tiny little tweaks that could kind of change the power level and let people who are creative deck builders and let people who you know, want to figure out decks and solve metas, it creates totally new game states for them. And certain decks might just pop up and people could like really make a run because they made some cool deck or some cool tweak to a deck because of whatever variable or system-wide change that existed in a given meta. And I know for other people, like that would probably just feel like too disruptive. So maybe it's not something you'd want to see in standard, or maybe it's like a slightly separate queue. But I just think it would be a way to keep the game fresh, because basically right now we have about a super fun week or two after an expansion launches, and then like I think a fun week after a mini set launches, and then most people just aren't really playing that much outside of that. I mean, I still have fun usually because we play really weird stuff, but most people want to win. I don't care about winning. So I don't know, something like that. I mean, more cards dumped would be great. That would be a perfect solution as well. I'd love just a new card every week. Even if they revealed it previously and then just unlocked it. I don't know if unlocks for cards happen like server side or what, but Just something to let us experiment and add some freshness to metas mid expansion. So this is a really cool question. What's your favorite card effect or design that didn't make it through? And Iksar says, for Stormwind, the Rokara pirate ship originally blew up your hand and turned it into a literal pirate ship that fired cannons and had buttons on it to press instead of drawing cards and playing them. UI cost was too high. What? That sounds crazy. I wish we'd seen that. And he had teased in like previous AMAs about like sort of this sort of thing, like crazy UI changes. I think I talked about it like being like maybe driving a siege engine in Alterac Valley or something, or in a, not Alterac Valley, but in like a PvP zone and WoW. Thought maybe that was the sort of thing like Wintergrasp or something, driving a PvP engine. Maybe it was this Rokara pirate ship, and that means we're not going to see this crazy UI thing that he's teased before. But anyway, he also says, for all time, we've had some weird card concepts. A card that caused you to gain and lose double stars if it started in your deck. A card that increased all numbers on other cards this game by 1. I liked both of those a lot. That's cool. I love stuff like that. As long as it's not too powerful and people feel forced to run those sorts of really disruptive cards. I would love for stuff like that to exist, to have fun builds and videos for, of course. So this one's about formats. Hearthstone will be around for a long time. In that time, I definitely see more constructed formats, just no current plans on one immediately on the horizon. Something between wild and standard might be nice, or something with different rules altogether, like you mentioned. So a lot of people want this, something that's like a hybrid where there are certain sort of sets locked or unlocked, almost kind of like Duels and Arena have, you know, specific wild sets and standard sets in there. But for just normal constructed Hearthstone as well. I'd be fine with that. I mean, I always have some concerns about splitting the player base out across too many formats, but that could be another way to introduce some freshness, basically, with rotating expansion options. All right, so yet again, a question about a new class. I think this is asked every week. So Iksar says the options are Death Knight, Monk, or new Hearthstone specific class. I've always teased a Tinkerer, like a kind of mech Tinkerer class. I think Monk is probably second or third on that list. So if you are expecting a new class, sounds like Monk isn't going to be the one. It's either going to be Death Knight or something new for Hearthstone. I think previously he said they'd rather do Death Knight than, or rather do a Warcraft class than a new class. So it sounds like the order, maybe, unless things have changed, of course, would be Death Knight, Hearthstone specific class, Monk. So Monk lovers out there, it might be years and years before you see a Monk. I think we'll get a new class eventually, but I think it's like, 2, 3, 5 year timeline, which, if there's 3 to 5 years between each class, Monk might be 10 years away. So I'm sorry, guys, if that's what you're looking for. Too bad. This is a cool question. Can you talk a bit about animation design? Questline animations take really long, and auctioneer quest, stealer, fragments make that turn kind of unplayable. And Iksar says, we could do a better job coordinating between card design and VFX in cases where we think there are decks that might trigger an effect 10 plus times in a short window. Not having that knowledge share is something we understand and are trying to be better at. So that's a nice recognition that there's a place to improve the game there. Some cards animations, probably fine to have them take a long time. Like big legendaries, you don't have a lot of decisions to make. Flesh those suckers out. Make them 3, 4, 5 seconds. Who cares, right? The artist character is a lot of work, I'm sure, but for players, we love it, right? But you got cards that have repeating effects where something goes off 15 times in a turn. You can't have a 3-second animation for that, right? You gotta tighten it up. So hopefully we see some changes there where those big repeating effects get much faster, because that's definitely a point of frustration. So here's a question about alternate art for cards, and Iksar says we have to be wary of understandability of the cards, but the answer is yes, we'd like to do it. In a collection-based game, it's fun to have alternate or special versions of your favorite stuff. I don't think that will ever mean 5 different versions of art for every card, but somewhere in between that and the 0 we have now. Also some customization of frames or text boxes that could work without needing the art to swap. So they're definitely looking for customizability and ownership of your cards a little more. I mean, as someone who plays the game a ton, I would love alternate art, of course. It wouldn't be hard for me or probably you to keep track of cards having different art. I don't think that would weird us out or surprise us or confuse us, but there is a portion of the player base who that might confuse, I'll admit. And even like when Battlegrounds get new hero skins, right? Like it's kind of, people get confused, like who is that I'm playing against? What hero is that? You know? And of course, there's ways to, you know, display that, and there's names and such, but still, it does add that like moment of confusion to people. So I'm still pro this. I mean, I think the pros here outweigh the cons. We're in a 7-year-old game or something at this point. Like most people kind of know what's going on. Adding a little confusion for the sake of a lot of extra fun, it seems worth it. What's a card subset mechanic that did really well internally during testing but flopped once it was in the hands of the general public? And Rosticon's getting insulted again here. Probably the shrines in Rosticon's. Gameplay was interesting, but power level was too low. We spent too much time playtesting low power decks versus each other, trying to find the fun, and not enough time jamming competitive decks to fine tune the balance. So in other words, they made some really fun cards that nobody got to play because they sucked. And yeah, the shrines, I think really only the rogue shrine was any good. I'm trying to think if there were any others, maybe one or two more that was all right. But yeah, that's sad. Rosticon's in general seemed like a pretty fun expansion that was just way undertuned. The mechanics at legendaries on average just not good enough. Hakar comes to mind, or not Hakar, Hyreek comes to mind. All right, and then I guess for my final question here, and by the way, there's like 15 I didn't read or answer, so I encourage you to check the link in the description to find the rest. They just didn't have a lot of great talking points, simple or just, you know, kind of easy stuff, but check those out if you're really curious. But final question here: if you considered increasing the starting health of all heroes to 35 or 40, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a long time since any control was playable, at least in Wild, and this could help against some of the more OTK-like quest lines. Iksar says control decks are unlikely to be a power player in Wild, even less so over time. Aggressive, synergistic decks rule and will continue to get faster and more synergistic over time. Nature of a format with a huge, ever-increasing card pool. And you know, that makes sense, right? Like when you have access to more and more and more stuff, and you never have any limitations to that stuff, you're just going to keep creating more and more busted synergies. Every little mana cheat card, every little tick up in damage, it all just starts to funnel down to like the most pure, crazy, aggressive strategy. And I don't play a lot of Wild, but it seems like that's pretty common. And it's a hard problem to fix too, right? Because Wild is always restricted by standard. So you can't go in and like print a 1 mana heal 10 health card or something to keep up with the crazy synergistic stuff, because that card has to exist in standard. And that card would be broken in standard because standard doesn't have the crazy aggressive synergistic stuff that Wild has. So you can't sort of do a tweak to make slower strategies feel better in Wild without also impacting standard based on the current model. So you know, maybe somewhere down the line there's like a 20 card set for Wild that's a Wild specific set. It just ignores standard, it goes straight to Wild, and it like tries to reset or compensate with some crazy control stuff. Now obviously 1 mana, you know, 10 armor 2/3 or something might not be the answer, but it might be, you know, whatever it is, something that sort of gives slower decks a way to combat the ever increasing speed and efficiency of Wild format decks, that also doesn't break standard. I don't know if that's something Blizzard cares about. They seem to just think Wild is a dumping ground. I think that's sad for Wild players, but so far that seems to be the reality. So yeah, I don't know. Seems like it needs a fix, but what is the fix? What do you guys think? What could they do to make Wild more reasonable and perhaps just a little bit slower? All right, that's a wrap. As you can see it here on the AMA, it's pretty crazy stuff. A mass nerf. How many cards would get nerfed? It's so crazy to think about. I don't know. Maybe we need a video on what should be mass nerfed at next rotation. We got another whole expansion to get through before then. But share your thoughts on all these questions down below. Thanks so much as always for watching. Stay tuned for more Stormwind videos in the near future. And until next time, game on.